Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We'll wait just a few more minutes to let some more participants join in. So one more minute. So it looks like we've stabilized a bit there, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to the launch of the report Disinformation Risk Assessment, the online news market in Australia, co-hosted by the QT Digital Media Research Centre in Brisbane, Australia, and the Global Disinformation Index. My name is Patrick Wickstrom. I am Director of the Digital Media Research Centre, and I will be your host during this event. Before we move on, I would like to acknowledge that QT is based on the Turrbal and Yugara people's land, and Turrbal and Yugara are the First Nations owners of the lands where QT now stands. And we pay respect to their elders, laws, and customs and creation spirits. We recognize that these lands have always been places for teaching, research, and learning. And QT acknowledges the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander play within the QT community. I would also like to say a couple of words about QT, the Digital Media Research Centre. Our centre is based at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. We're a bit more than 100 social science and humanities researchers doing world-leading communication, media, and law research at the forefront of digital transformation with a vision to create a flourishing digital society. And our research programs investigate topics such as the digital transformation of media industries, the challenges of digital inclusion and governance, the growing role of AI and automation in the information environment, and the role of social media in public communication. So we have a wonderful panel tonight, and I will say a few words about each one of the panelists to introduce them properly. I'm not sure which order they are on your screen, but I will start with Esther Chan. Esther is the Bureau Chief in Sydney for First Draft, an organization that I'm sure Esther will say more about, but with a mission to protect communities from harmful misinformation. And Esther started her career in television as an investigative reporter in Hong Kong before moving into digital journalism at Storyful. She helped launch the Australian branch of AFP's fact-check operation in 2019 and has since been covering social media anomalies and mis and disinformation, primarily in Australia, Hong Kong, and China. Claire Melford is co-founder and executive director of the Global Disinformation Index. Claire has a background in both commercial and non-for-profit sectors. Among other things, she was formerly CEO of the International Business Leaders Forum and the managing director of MTV Networks Nordics. She has worked on startups in e-commerce, fintech, and edtech, and Claire is also a founding board member of Girls Not Brides, the global coalition to end child marriage. Ehsan Degan is a lecturer in digital media at the School of Communication QT and a researcher in the DMRC. His work includes the investigation of issues such as polarization, political discussions on social media, fake news, information flows on platforms, and the dynamics of discursive struggles on social media. Stephen Harrington is an associate professor in the School of Communication at QT as well, and his work focuses on popular media and the evolving forms of journalism practice, and understanding how these contemporary innovations shape and affect the relationships between ordinary citizens and politics. Sofia Glasinova is a postdoctoral research fellow at the DMRC. She specializes in political communication, digital media, Russian media, information warfare, and digital propaganda. And lastly, Tim Graham is a DECRA fellow at the DMRC and a lecturer in the School of Communication at QUT. And his research combines computational methods with social theory to study online networks and platforms, with a particular interest in online bots and trolls, disinformation, and online ratings and rankings devices. So I'm very excited to spend the next 80-90 minutes with this panel and to present and discuss the report that we are launching today. And first out is Claire Melford, who will introduce the Global Disinformation Index and say a few words about the background to this report. So over to you, Claire, and I'll stop sharing my screen so you can do that, Claire.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Really appreciate you guys, all of the work that you guys have done and making the time available today for this presentation, and appreciate that everybody else other than me who is in London is pretty late for you guys. So let me just share this screen. I'm hoping you can now see a gray slide with GDI overview. Wonderful. So what is GDI and how does the Australia report that we're launching today fit into the wider context of what GDI is trying to do? So when I and my co-founder, Dr. Danny Rogers, started GDI 2.5 years ago, we did so because we could see that the challenge of online disinformation was being widely admired by many, but with few offering practical solutions. And actually none at that point of the organizations that were studying this challenge was what I would call following the money. There was a large financial motive that we had seen emerge to create toxic, divisive content that we see online. And this is largely due to the fact that the internet is funded by advertising, and the primary way that content creators and platforms make money is through advertising. And in a world of unlimited content, to get paid, you want your content to get eyeballs. And the more extreme you can make your content, the more we humans like to click on it. Hence, the more advertising we can be shown while we are liking, sharing, commenting, or maybe even reading some of the content. But let me first tell you a little bit about GDI. We are a neutral, independent, non-profit, and our mission is to disrupt and defund this disinformation, to break this automatic link between clicks on content and the ad dollars that follow it. We do this by assessing news sites on their risk of containing disinformation or being a disinforming actor. And we do it using a combination of human intelligence and artificial intelligence. And these risk assessments of news sites can then be used by the advertising online ecosystem to decide to help advertisers make choices about where their adverts end up online. So we produce the index, we use intelligence analysts to help us research the disinformation narratives that are emerging. And we have an insight unit that helps translate this all into policy actions that tech companies, platforms, and governments can make to help defund disinformation. But it's important that we define what disinformation is. At GDI, we define disinformation through the lens of adversarial narratives. An adversarial narrative is any narrative which sets you, the reader, in conflict with the subject of the story. And the subject of the story can be a group, an at-risk group, people of color, women, people of different religions, sexualities. It can be an institution like the judiciary, the police, the media, or it can be science itself. And we see this a lot with anti-vax conspiracies, climate change denial conspiracies, 5G, and a host of other different types of conspiracy theory. And most important of all, an adversarial narrative carries a real risk of harm. So to defund adversarial narratives, we really need to break this automatic link between the toxic content, the engaging content, and the ad system that follows it. So at GDI, we do this in a couple of ways. For the small number of very high profile sites in any one market, we use human reviewers, and that's what we'll be talking about today, who assess the site using a methodology based on the Journalism Trust Initiative, as you'll hear later. The Journalism Trust Initiative is the only ISO, International Standards Organization, standard for news media designed by journalists. And this is what the team will talk about for the rest of the day. For the rest of the internet, which is quite a large place, we use artificial intelligence classifiers to assess the risk of sites carrying adversarial narratives. And we track the ones I've mentioned before, all of the hate speech narratives, science disinformation, electoral disinformation. But today is about the human review part of what GDI does. The methodology that we are exploring today and presenting the results for Australia has been, or by the end of this year, will have been deployed in over 19 countries. And by next year, we hope to get that number up to 25, and you can see some of them here on the slide. But a final thought before I hand over to our partners about how these risk ratings can be used to disrupt the funding, the business model of disinformation. I want to just show you an Australia-specific slide, which is, well, it's actually many countries, why it's so important for advertisers to take this information seriously. Consumers do hold advertisers accountable for the information beside which their ads appear. This is a slide from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is published every January. This 2021 barometer measured for the first time the percentage of respondents in over 28 countries surveyed that thought that advertisers should stop advertising on any media that did not prevent the spread of what in this case was called fake news. Across the globe, about 72% of respondents to this survey thought, yes, advertisers should take action to remove their adverts and not provide funding to sites that continually disinform. And in Australia, that number was pretty much in line. It was about 68%. So the public see a really important role for advertisers in cutting the ad dollar funding to sites that traffic in harmful adversarial narratives. And we hope at GDI that our assessments of news sites can help them do just that. And equally importantly, help those sites which are providing high quality, trusted journalism receive a much fairer share of the ad market that over the last few years they have been consistently losing. And with that, I will hand back to Patrick.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Claire. I should say before we start with the presentation of the report that in your Zoom windows, you'll see in the bottom button that says Q&A. Please use the Q&A to post your questions to the panelists. I will be your voice and read them out to the panelists so they can respond to them. And you can do that at any time during the seminar. We might not pick them up straight away when you post your questions, but you can post them there at any time. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is Ehsan, who will start out with the presentation of the report. So over to you, Ehsan.
Thank you, Patrick. So, all right, you should hopefully see my screen. All right, and thanks, Claire, for the introduction and the definitions of this information that we're using throughout the report. So, historically, Australia has had generally a high media concentration, and the majority of media outlets, especially printed outlets, newspapers, were dominated by News Corp and Nine Entertainment. And of course, with the increasing ubiquity of digital news, there is now more diversity of opinions and voices in the media ecosystem, but the overall dominance of news and News Corp and Nine is still felt, and it is evident. And of course, with an increase in digital news and also the popularity of reading and sharing news on social media, there come specific considerations, specific concerns, and the need for addressing misinformation and disinformation online is now felt more than ever before. A good example of such efforts in tackling disinformation online is, of course, the Global Disinformation Index and what we have been doing in the past few months. Other examples could be the DG Code of Practice in Australia, which was launched in February, and it aims to reduce the risk of online misinformation on technology companies, major technology companies. And this code was adopted by major players in the field, such as Facebook, Google, and Twitter. And of course, another aspect that shows the significance of digital news and news shared and disseminated on social media is the two-way relationship that they have, where the news outlets create content, but they at the same time rely on social media platforms for the dissemination of this news and the engagement that it brings. And also the platforms benefit from the contents shared and discussed on them. And the news bargaining code, which was quite controversial and widely discussed in the first half of this year, really shows this two-way relationship and how governments would design bargaining codes to address some of the challenges that Australian media face in terms of advertising revenue. So it is really the role of media in publication and dissemination of information or disinformation is really undeniable. And in this report, we aim to have an evaluation of the Australian media ecosystem in terms of their risk of publishing disinformation. To do this, we selected 34 digital news websites, and in the selection process, we started with the sites with the highest reach based on their Alexa rating, social media followers, and engagement ratings. But because of other contextual considerations, such as the high media concentration, the different community interests, political interests, regional outlets, we tried to balance this list and include other outlets, even though they weren't among the highest rankings on Alexa. So we reviewed these sites in two distinct pillars, content pillar and operations pillar. The content pillar, which I will mostly talk about, focuses on the reliability of content provided on the site. And the operations pillar, which Sophia will discuss, looks at the operational and editorial integrity of the sites. So starting with an overview of the overall scores, we can see that in general, there aren't so many outlets at high risk of publishing or spreading disinformation in the Australian media ecosystem. Majority of the sites were in the low and minimum category, and only 6 sites were categorized as medium risk, 3 as high or extreme risk, or to be more specific, 2 at high risk and 1 at extreme risk. The other 25 were all at minimum or low risk. But these overall scores are the final scores for these sites, which averages the scores they received from the operations and content pillar. And when we break down these scores into the two different pillars, we will see more nuances to this picture. So in the content pillar, what we did was to review 10 articles from each of these outlets. So in total, 340 articles, which were selected and anonymized before they came to us as reviewers. So while reviewing, we didn't know which article is from which outlet. And those 340 articles covered a range of different types of articles that you would see on digital news sites, such as straight news, soft news, lifestyle content, opinion pieces. And when we look at the content pillar independently, we can see that overall the digital news in Australia performed relatively well in this pillar. And there was a generally high average score in this pillar, 79. And where sites could see more improvement is mainly in the operations pillar. So while on the average overall scores is 63, we have a score of 79 on average in content pillar, while it's only 47 for the operations pillar. And breaking these pillars into the different risk categories, we can clearly see that in all the different risk categories, the sample sites received significantly higher scores in their content pillar than in the operations pillar. So the content pillar is basically comprised of a series of different indicators that we looked at individually. And the main areas of improvement in this pillar are indicators of recent coverage, common coverage, and presence of leads. So recent coverage refers to sites publishing newsworthy events that generally occurred in the past 30 days before the publication of an article. So it's generally an indicator of newsworthiness of content rather than publishing articles that may be too old or may have been taken out of context. The common coverage indicator relates to publishing news that were also covered by other reliable local media outlets. So it is an indication of the indicator of the publication of significant events through news events and the like. And finally, the fact-based leads, which was surprisingly absent from many of the articles that we reviewed and led to lower scores in this category, is an indicator that refers to the first paragraph in an article, which arguably is the most important paragraph for readers clicking on an article. It's the first thing they read, and generally we expect it to be a fact-based first paragraph. In all the other indicators, such as avoiding the use of sensationalist language or sensationalist visuals, or the presence of byline information, objectivity as much as possible, and avoiding bias or targeting individuals or entities, majority of sites performed relatively well. So overall, the majority of the reviewed sites performed really well in the content pillar, and only 6 sites received scores that were significantly below the average in this pillar. And the findings for the operations pillar, however, are to some extent different from the content pillar, and Sophia will discuss these in the next section. Thank you, and I'll stop sharing my screen and move over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Essen. I'm now sharing my slides. I hope you can see them too. So I'm going to talk about operations pillar, and within operations pillar, we looked at a variety of different indicators, and you can see them on the slide. So we evaluated some commenting policies of the news website, as well as we looked at whether the information about the ownership or funding sources of news outlets is present on the websites. And we also looked at different code of conduct and editorial practices that we looked for and saw whether they were available, as well as the 2 indicators, which is ensuring accuracy, when we looked at different fact-checking protocols or processes that were supposed to be mentioned on the news websites, as well as an indicator called attribution, which responds for different policies that provide accurate and transparent information about facts and contents that should be sourced in the news media. So we looked at these indicators, and we found that, first of all, the average for operations pillar is relatively low for Australian media market. And We also looked through indicators that were low in this regard, and these are the information about funders, the fact-checking processes, and as well as attribution. So on this slide, you can see the overall rating for operations pillar, and you can see that there are two best performing news websites, which are SBS and ABC, and they got it around 70 or 75 points out of 100. And we also connect this that these are public service media outlets, and it means that they should provide extensive information about the editorial practices and policies, and they do so. And around 5 websites, they actually performed significantly below average. And also we connect this with this and other websites. We connect it with 3 low indicators, or 3 kind of absence or not enough. There was not enough information about several policies, such as, for example, the information about funders. We found it in most of the outlets, and regardless whether they're big or small, whether they associated with 2 major media networks in Australia. So this information was or not present or hidden, and we couldn't find it. Another one was we saw some bits and pieces in editorial kind of code of conduct about the fact-checking processes. So some outlets mentioned that they are fact-checking their articles or content, but at the same time, they didn't mention any protocols or any procedures that they were using, as well as some post-publication correction policies. And the lowest score within the operations pillar was in regards to attribution. So 5 media outlets scored 0 in this regard, which means that they didn't abide by the policies of providing accurate and transparent information about the facts and content that they are providing, or the media. So sometimes they would say, for example, under the images supplied, or Facebook, which didn't give information about the sources of information. And following that, I think it's also important to talk about several limitations that we faced, and that this methodology that we were using didn't allow us, for example, to evaluate. So first of all, we looked mostly in the content pillar on text and visual content and not videos. And I think by including videos, we actually, some of the scores could be changed in regards to disinformation risks. The other thing that when we were thinking about the high content pillar scores, we assume that maybe and partly it is associated with the high concentration of the media market in Australia. And by saying that, we think that major networks have more resources, time and effort, and more staff to verify, for example, and check and edit some of the content compared to small media outlets that don't have a lot of resources to do that. But of course, we couldn't evaluate it within this methodology. And I think that maybe further research should actually look at that. Another thing which is also interesting, that we didn't look at the particular controversial topics and how they were covered over time within these media outlets, which I think also could actually signal about some disinformation risks. So for example, we can find that some media outlets specifically ignore some controversial topics, for example, climate change, and also actually the opposite. So some media outlets could promote some strategic narratives or adversarial narratives. And we couldn't evaluate that because we looked mostly at the recent coverage or most popular coverage. And the last limitation that I think is worth mentioning too, that within our sample of news, we saw a small percentage of articles written by Indigenous Australians. And with the methodology that we were using, we couldn't classify them under a particular genre that was offered, for example, opinion or feature, because mostly these pieces were written in a storytelling genre, and they were based on the experience of authors, their ancestors or elders. And actually, this kind of didn't correlate with what we were coding according to our codes and system. And I think also future research should look into that more in detail, and I think it will be interesting to compare this with experience of other countries, for example, Canada, where also there are a lot of outlets and articles written by First Nations people. And I will also now talk about recommendations that are based on this analysis. And on this slide, you can also see the different indicators that, again, that we were looking at, and we concluded and made them based on the law indicators that you can see on both pillars. So based on this analysis, we recommend that within content pillar, news websites should contain a clear lead in the articles, so which can provide a factual basis for the articles and which readers can know and read before an actual article. So in some way to know what is the essence of this news piece, and don't be led by several authors' opinions or bias. As well as it is better to use the different dates for the events that news pieces or different authors describe in, because it can also lead to newsworthy events, and also it shows the and connects it with the and gives more clear context of the events described in the articles. For the operations pillar in general, we recommend to adopt and make transparent the different editorial and journalistic practices and make them apparent on the website. And such standards can be found in, for example, Journalism Trust Initiative. So they will ensure this, again, openness and transparency, and different policies that outlets will show that they follow. We, within this, we recommend that news websites increase the transparency about fact-checking process and what procedures they're following, as well as that there should be separate section on the websites which clearly states that this is, for example, opinion pieces, and by this readers will be not misguided, and they will know that this is a particular opinion of particular author, and they will make their choices on the content based on that. So I think this is it from me. Thank you for listening, and you can find the full version of the report via this link. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sofia and Ehsan. That was a great presentation of a report, really interesting findings that came out of this study. So to contextualize the Australian study with the other 18 studies that Global Disinformation has done so far, I asked Claire to share some insights on how Australia is positioned in with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Patrick. It's before I launch into that, I will put the caveat on this that as we have sampled a very wide range of studies in our soon to be 19 media market reviews, everything from Estonia and Georgia to the US and Australia. Comparisons between countries are perhaps less helpful than they might be, but there are a few high-level things that I think we can draw out. The first is that overall, the Australian market fits within the category of countries with a very high proportion of low and minimum risk websites, which is great and is what we would expect to see. In markets similar to Canada, for example, where the vast majority of the sites we reviewed received a low or a minimum risk rating. And it is also true that most of the countries we have reviewed, and Australia is no different, the content pillar always performs better than the operations pillar, which is good news because it's the content where the real touch point with the reader occurs. And the operations pillar, all the transparency issues around whether policies on ownership and funding and editorial independence, etc., are freely available, that's actually relatively straightforward to fix. So there is an opportunity across all of the countries we've reviewed, and in Australia, it's no different, for sites to improve the level of transparency that they provide. And that's we found certainly in the countries with less developed media markets, perhaps relatively recently democratic countries. It's that level of transparency that has become critical to minimizing the chance of disinformation slipping through. So work on the operations pillar is a relatively light lift for media companies around the world to improve their scores. And the other point I'll make is that the whole purpose of doing this from GDI's perspective is to provide advertisers with more choice about where their ads end up. And that is for the twin goals of cutting the funding to very toxic narratives and toxic websites, but equally importantly, redirecting that funding back to high quality sites, the sorts of sites that make up the majority of the survey we're looking at today. And we are finding that advertisers around the world are increasingly paying attention to that. They are increasingly looking at sources of trusted news and external validations of sources of trusted news to help them inform what advertisers call their inclusion lists, sites that they will buy adverts on, as well as their exclusion lists, sites that they won't buy adverts on. So we are finding more and more that independent assessments of high quality journalist content are being used by advertisers as a way of guiding their spend decisions. So we hope very much that over time, these sorts of risk assessments that GDI and others provide will help redirect some of the advertising flows that have melted away from the more mainstream high quality news over the last decade.
Thank you so much, Claire. What the next phase of this webinar is where we've asked 3 experts, Esther, Stephen, and Tim, to provide their insights and perspectives on this report and how it relates from with their own work in research or in first draft, which is where Esther is coming from. And Esther, you're going first, so over to you.
Thanks, Patrick. Hey everyone, my name is Esther. I am the Bureau Editor for First Draft in the APAC region. So just a little bit about our company. Our headquarters is in New York. We're a nonprofit dedicated to equip people with the knowledge and tools. So the idea is that when you learn more about this stuff, you learn about how to verify information, you learn about how to debunk information, and you're better protected against harmful information online. So on a day-to-day basis, we would monitor the internet for mis and disinformation. We conduct in-depth research into these false and misleading narratives. And we also provide training on monitoring, verification, and responsible reporting. So it was really interesting to listen to all of you talking about GDI. It's a completely different way of looking at the disinformation problem, and one that I really enjoy learning about. But I will just take you away from that for a moment to talk about our research in the past year, like what we found in Australia in terms of the disinformation landscape. So unsurprisingly, in the last year, one of the most prominent themes is related to COVID pandemic, right? But then under this whole umbrella of COVID, there are actually several areas that have dominated the Australian social media landscape. And they are, number one, the vaccines, and number two, related to personal freedom. So this is about lockdown, other restrictions, and measures such as the so-called vaccine passport. And then number three, you have conspiracy theories. So on top of all these, of course, there are genuine confusion, misinterpretation of issues, and misunderstanding as well. So there have been a lot of questions about whether the vaccine is effective in cutting down the viral load in the vaccinated, or whether alternative treatment like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine would help and are good enough that we don't need to be vaccinated. And the reason why misinformation has a chance to flourish here is really because there is what we call a data void, right? Because there's a lack of credible information on the topic, and that's why bad information has a chance to circulate continuously online. And unfortunately as well, we've actually seen a number of these false and misleading claims being amplified by some politicians in Australia, as well as some media headlines as well. So First of all, when we talk about vaccines, most of the disinformation that we found in Australia are related to, number one, there are possible safety issues, efficacy and necessity. And then number two, it would be about, whether there are political or economic motives behind the vaccination drives and the procurement of the vaccines. So these themes that have been popular in Australia actually align with what we've seen around the world as well. So last November, First Draft published a long-form research report. So we looked at 1,200 social media posts in English, Spanish, and French, and trying to kind of come up with the popular themes of vaccine disinformation around the world. And we found that in that report, number one was political economic motives, and number two, it's about vaccines safety and efficacy. So the same we also noticed in Australia as well. So in Australia, we've also noticed that people have been really concerned about whether the vaccine is safe for children and teenagers, because there is a smaller chance for them to be hospitalized or die from COVID. We've actually seen a lot of discussions about this in some other closed or semi-closed spaces like Telegram. So, there are a lot of saying that children will become guinea pigs or, being sacrificed for the experimental vaccine and things like that. And moving on to the second type of disinfo related to the pandemic, that's to do with personal freedom. So this is an issue tied to lockdown and other restrictions, as well as the latest announcements about the so-called vaccine passport, right? And the notion is that these measures infringe upon people's freedom and rights to gather, kind of pushes all kinds of conspiracy theories about like the government's forcing the vaccine on people. So, and also that, the ease restrictions is kind of a way that the government uses to alienate the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. And we found that, we looked into the protests in Melbourne last week, and it's a good case study on how this, when people are not happy in society because of a number of reasons, because of slow vaccination drive, closed borders, unemployment, etc., they would be driven out onto the street. And not only that, the frustration sometimes would attract people who have other motives. For example, I'm sure you've seen in the reports that we noticed some neo-Nazis and known figures from the right-wing fringes. They were seen in the protests alongside some well-known anti-vaccine influencers as well. So here's the problem, right? Because social media kind of enables some extremists to take advantage of events where people are presenting their genuine concerns. That's why, when it comes to media reports, journalists need to be really careful when they're reporting on a protest like this, because even though, yeah, sure, there were a number of well-known figures from the far-right groups, in the protest, but there was no evidence at all whether they organized a protest or infiltrated a protest, like some media reports suggested. So what we do at First Draft, we put our advice on how to avoid giving these people free airtime, right? Because when you share a link to their live stream or repeating what they were saying, or those unverified claims, you're basically helping them reach an audience that they otherwise probably wouldn't have. And last but not least, we noticed there are a number of conspiracy theories related to the pandemic. And one of the most notable one is probably the lab leak theory. And sometimes when you notice a theory is popular, it's not because they're completely made up, but because there's a kernel of truth, right? And the lab leak theory is a good example because the first reports of COVID did come from Wuhan, and there is a lab that has been doing experiments for years on coronaviruses. But the thing is, because of this grain of truth and because investigation is ongoing, sometimes media reports don't really get it right. And sometimes they treat, an ongoing investigation as conclusive evidence. So it really confuses the readers, and unfortunately, some people suffer. For example, in this case, because we're talking about Wuhan and China, we've noticed a lot of a surge of attacks against Asians around the world. So I guess I wouldn't go into this in detail, but another key area of our research in the past year is Australia's relations with China. And also we looked into mis and disinformation flowing through the Chinese diaspora in Australia as well. So those are just some of the areas of concern at First Draft, and we just hope to continue doing this work, and we can offer advice and support journalists with our research as well.
Thank you so much, Esther. That was really interesting to hear about the great work that you do, and relate that to the findings and that came from this study that we just talked about. I should say before we move on to the next speaker that we have some great questions in the Q&A. I'll pick them up once we've heard from Tim and Stephen, and just keep them coming. Put them in there. So I'll read them to the panel in a short while. The next speaker we will hear from is Stephen Harrington. So over to you, Stephen.
Great, thank you, Patrick. I'm actually going to share some slides, if that's okay. That will just help me a little bit in organising some of my thoughts. So I hope you can see that. There we go. So first of all, I just want to say thanks very much for having me as part of the panel, and congratulations to everyone involved in the writing and now launching of the report. It's really great to see. My personal interest in this topic really is centering around the ARC funded study that I'm a part of with my QT colleagues, Axel Bruns and Dan Angus, and also Eddie Hercombe and Scott Wright at Monash in Melbourne, along with a couple of international partners. That project that I'm working on at the moment is about halfway completed, I guess in theory. And what my kind of component within that, and something that follows on from the research that I've been doing over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, is really getting, I think, a kind of a broader idea of the way that mis and disinformation intersects with politics, and how it kind of is used culturally, and it's kind of, if you like, its broader effects, to use that term. And what we're trying to do in that particular project is get away from that term fake news, first of all. So I think it's obviously a problematic one, and it's a relatively limited term because it describes something that I think is only a part of this broader problem of disinformation. And I think what's super important, and this definitely follows on from a couple of the previous speakers, is the importance, I think, of acknowledging and realizing that this is a problem that has pretty major social and political dimensions as well. And it is, I think, quite a lot more than just, in a lot of cases, the absence of good information. So I'm definitely following on from other scholars in making this point as well, but in particular, a great paper that was written a couple of years ago by Sylvia Weisbord, who really just talks about this problem more broadly, and saying that disinformation and misinformation is not just a problem of not having enough good news or good information. So we need to kind of appreciate, I suppose, the bigger problem. And just the example that I want to talk about quite briefly, and I apologize if all my thoughts are a little bit scattered on this, but it's quite a big, complicated issue. And obviously the attack on the US Capitol building was a really substantial moment, I think, in global politics, certainly in my lifetime anyway. And to me, it actually speaks to the need to open up the conversation quite a bit more. So I think this is a problem that is, of course, driven very much by social media platforms. And of course, we've heard quite a lot about the ways in which people organised to engage in that particular right through social media platforms, but also the limitations and problems that Facebook has had, and its unwillingness, if you like, to actually crack down on the mis and disinformation problem on its platform, and the kind of, let's say, the political and economic aspects to this as well. But I think that's been pretty well covered, and I think that social media is too often at the centre of the narratives around disinformation. And I think what we also really need to think about, and this is one of the reasons why I really appreciate the work that this report is doing, and the GDI more broadly, is to think about how important, actual mainstream traditional news sources are in something like this, where obviously what we go for these days, news organizations are always seeking out is audience engagement and metrics thereof. And the obvious problem of, the easiest way to get engagement being to create division or create, arguments amongst your audience. Certainly one of my least favorite types of news report is X person said this, Y person said that. What do you think, audience? And just let an argument unfold in the comments section. And this is, I think, driving much of that that social division and this adversarial narrative that was being discussed and talked about before, which I'll come back to very briefly. But I think there is also this real problem of inadvertent kind of rebroadcasting or amplification of disinformation. So even where we have well-known, high-quality news outlets, in America, let's say the New York Times or the Washington Post and others, were also carriers of the kind of misinformation that led to people thinking that democracy was being stolen for them and kind of gave them some justification for marching on the Capitol. And in a slightly different domain, I'm going to give a small plug to a paper that was just published, I think, earlier this week, coming out of that ARC-funded study that I was talking about. My colleague Axel Bruns and Edward Hercombe and I were talking about the misinformation around the link between COVID and 5G, excuse me, that was quite prominent early on in the pandemic last year. And one of the things that we found along the way was that often it was celebrity news or when that particular topic was covered within celebrity news, because a famous person, such as, let's say, Woody Harrelson was one of the cases we looked at, had shared some news that there was a link between COVID and 5G on social media, even though that was thoroughly debunked by the I guess you might say, the more serious broadsheet journalists. When it was covered as celebrity news, it was just rebroadcast and not given the kind of treatment that it really required. And so there are lots of ways that this kind of inadvertently occurs, where journalists, thinking that they're doing the right thing, are actually just providing this sort of oxygen, if you like, to use a term that Whitney Phillips has used before, to these kind of bits of misinformation and disinformation. So I think that is one of the things that we really need to be quite mindful of, and to actually think about what journalists and news organizations can actually do to avoid it, because it is a really big problem. If they ignore that news, let's say another example would be a tweet from Nicki Minaj a couple of weeks ago. If it's really hard for news organizations who are so incentivized to cover what people are talking about to ignore something if it contains disinformation. And if they do so, then it looks like they're hiding something. But then if they do give it coverage, then they also have this problem of rebroadcasting it. But I think that the other thing that to me is it's kind of like the elephant in the room that we actually also need to talk about, is where we actually have cases of news organizations actually working hand in glove with political operatives and providing a lot of cases of intellectual justification or a rationale for misinformation and disinformation that's being spread, particularly by politicians. And I'm thinking, for example, here about an organization like Fox News, that it's one of the biggest news organizations in America, and yet it was probably really, I think, central to making many of the claims that led people to engage in that particular right. And I came across this quote in writing a paper just recently by Ivor Gaber and Caroline Fisher, who were talking about the case of Brexit. And this idea of what they call the strategic lie. And they say the inadvertent legitimization also occurred when journalists sought to challenge these lies by accepting these statements as potentially factual, and therefore worthy of coverage, journalists were guilty of admitting them into what Helen describes as the sphere of legitimate controversy. So I think that is right there one of the big challenges that we need to be considering, is the way that even if a news report is thoroughly debunking something, the way that just by even talking about it and giving that sort of airtime, it gives that kind of credence and legitimacy. And I think that critical word there being potentially factual. So just to finish off, I think that on top of that sort of social media and mainstream news, we also really need to think about the way that this is driven through and by politics. So the strategic political uses of essentially lies. And again, that builds on the quote that I was just talking about before. But also a kind of broader issue with citizens and kind of, if you like, human nature. Because I think that so much of what we see and we consume in the news, and a kind of a classic frame in political journalism particularly, is this adversarialism and this side versus that side. And I think we're actually really starting to see some pretty major consequences of that. And again, picking up on what was said before about vaccine hesitancy, there's certainly anecdotal evidence that a lot of people who are, particularly in America, reluctant to get a vaccine are reluctant because it seemed to be something that is the domain of liberals and left-wingers, and actually to get a vaccine is a political statement that says that left-wingers have something valid and useful to say, and that substantial division is a real problem that's having all this kind of knock-on effects. And just to sort of revert back to something that I sound like a broken record in many ways, something that I've been saying for well over a decade. I think that this really speaks to the need to find new ways of presenting news, and presenting news in an engaging way that doesn't rely on conflict as its primary way of getting people to pay attention. That addressing kind of factual issues and dealing with reality in a kind of calm and sane way that will still engage audiences is I think a really big challenge, and getting away from that primary frame of adversarialism and this side versus that side. Anyway, that's it from me. Thanks very much again for having me, and I think I'll be passing over to Tim shortly. Thanks. That's
correct. Thank you so much, Stephen, for those insights. It's really interesting to hear your perspectives on disinformation and the work has been done as part of this study. So thank you for that. That takes us, as you said, Stephen, to Timothy Graham. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks again for inviting me to participate. It's great to be on board and to discuss such an interesting and problematic topic. I'm going to try and be very brief, and I haven't prepared slides, but one thing that I really wanted to pick up on, and I think, Stephen mentioned elephants in rooms before, and I think that one of the things that really struck me was the low attribution scores across the board in the pillar, the operations pillar. So, the report defines attribution as the rating for the number of policies and practices identified on the site, which ensure that facts and content are accurately and transparently sourced and attributed. And I mean, I think it's somewhat concerning to see that 5 of the media outlets flunked completely and got a score of 0, on this attribution metric. But I think, one of the reflections that I have, and so much of what I have prepared here just echoes, what Esther and Stephen had said, and what had come out of the report as well. It sort of doesn't surprise me in some ways. And even though I can't see the, the nitty-gritty details, there is a data void, as Esther sort of mentioned before, about, which particular news media outlets are scoring extremely low on this. But the fact that attribution kind of doesn't really factor in as an important part of the policies and procedures, like this to me is I think, symptomatic of very broad kind of changes and shifts in the disinformation landscape. And certainly what I've seen in Australia, I mean, the last 2 years have been extraordinary. We kicked off 2020 with bushfires, and we had a storm of mis and disinformation. And again, First Draft News, kudos for covering so much of that. And I learned a great deal from that. And then straight into COVID. Really, the last 2 years have provided such a litany of case examples. But without, I mean, I don't want to get too micro or too nitpicky here, but I'd like to really quickly pick up on some research that that myself and other colleagues in the DMRC have been doing, looking at Sky News Australia. And I think that Sky News Australia is a particularly interesting news channel and outlet in Australia. One of the questions I have around Sky News Australia and the problem of attribution is basically this. I'm puzzling over the extent to which attribution, whether it's even relevant, to the incentivized kind of political economy of content that at least the online aspect of Sky News Australia is pushing. And so some of the work that we've done, so Axel Bruns, Simon Copland from ANU, and myself, looking at the sharing patterns of Sky News Australia videos across Facebook and YouTube, something that we've found is that they produce a lot of high volume video content that targets and is widely shared by large online audiences that are, you could broadly characterize them as conspiracy theory groups and hyperpartisan, right-wing and far-right pages and groups. They appear to produce this content specifically because these audiences lap it up so quickly. It speaks so much to the identity politics, the brand, and the market interest in this kind of content that it. I wonder to what extent there is even any concern or operational thought given to whether what is being promoted and spread in this content is true or false. I mean, it's not that there's necessarily false information that's being spread maliciously, this textbook definition of harm, but to what extent does truth even matter? And I mean, I'd like to highlight one really interesting case example. And it was around the Victorian Premier, Dan Andrews, who injured his back and was off work for 3 months or a bit more than 3 months in early March 2021. And something that I still am trying to understand and make sense of is the explosion of conspiracy theories that circulated almost immediately after Dan Andrews had this injury. And I'm not going to amplify any of these in particular, but there were a number of really concerning, unsavory conspiracy theories circulating. And I did see what was really interesting was how certain news agencies and news channels picked up on this, on the fact that there were fringe groups on Telegram and Facebook for months spreading this and promoting this. And these news agencies they knew that people wanted to know about it. They knew that their constituents would be interested in this. And, without going into the specifics, there are news videos and news stories that basically lay these out on the table and amplify them. There was such a data void of information about what was happening with the Victorian Premier that the media ecosystem and people who were stuck in their homes scrolling and having opportunities to try and, I mean, they had not much else to do, I imagine, were engaging with this in such high volume. And I guess what is really concerning about this is that so returning back to the notion of attribution, which I think was one of the really interesting takeaways and findings of this report, is that through this lens of adversarial narratives, you know, this kind of low credibility, partisan online news content, it kind of serves as like a disinformation engine in Australia. At least that's what it appears to be to me. And, you know, there's this question around, well, what is the harm? You know, what harm is being done here? And I think that, like, what I would like to propose very quickly, and I know that I'm trying to organize my thoughts here and do them in a rather rapid way. I want to kind of pick up on the definition of disinformation in terms of, you know, adversarial narratives that cause harm. And I think that this kind of content, it's often adversarial to liberal democracy. So this throwing out this noise into the ecosystem, amplifying rumors, not so much spreading lies or falsehoods, but more spreading questioning the truth and throwing out false and true information at the same time and seeing what sticks. You know, I think that this is adversarial to the very epistemic conditions that we need for a healthy media ecosystem, for a healthy democracy. So, you know, to quote Yochai Benkler, I think this kind of content that gets promoted without any interest in attribution. I mean, it's not that the policies and procedures aren't there, perhaps they are, but they're just irrelevant. We put it out there and we get millions of clicks of this content. You know, as Benkler says, you know, they diminish our collective capacity to tell truth from falsehood and reason from its absence. So, you know, anything goes, I suppose, is one of the takeaways that I have as I study this kind of content, and the fact that the lowest score in the report, the lowest average score, was this attribution metric. To me, I think it's a really interesting finding, and it's very symptomatic of so many diseases or so many problems that I think we see emerging in the Australian ecosystem. I hope that makes sense. I probably should have prepared slides, but these are just some thoughts, you know, from the work that I've been doing with my colleagues. So thank you.
That's great, Tim. Thank you so much. And I'd like to, before we go to Q&A, I'd like to check with Claire and with Sophia and Ehsan as the researchers heavily involved in this. If you have any response perhaps, or some thoughts that were kicked off by Esther's and Tim's and Stephen's reflections.
Would you like me to go first, Patrick?
Sure.
I hope the background noise behind me is not too bothersome. So I had a number of reflections, and thank you so much to Esther, Tim, and Stephen for very, very interesting contributions. I think the things that struck me from your contributions were quite how widespread a societal challenge disinformation is. We often say at GDI, it's a whole of a society issue, and it's going to require a whole of society problem. This isn't just about organizations like GDI trying to disrupt the funding. It's not just about organizations like First Draft providing invaluable support and help to journalists in how to navigate the coverage of disinformation. It's about politics. It's about politicians willfully misusing the systems that have developed for other purposes, such as for online advertising. It really is a challenge that touches on the whole of society. And to pick up on some of Tim's points, the whole point, if you are a hostile state actor, is to undermine other more democratic nations' belief in democracy. That is the point of information operations. And that is what they set out to do. The adversarial narratives that Russia, for example, peddles often contain grains of truth, mixed in with a lot of non-factually correct stuff. But it is not, as we always say at GDI, it is not about a false binary between truth or falsehood. If it was, we'd be trying to remove all mentions of Father Christmas or Santa Claus from the internet, and we're not. It is about whether the narratives are contributing to an undermining of trust in the institutions that support our way of life. And that's why I think disinformation is one of the key challenges of our time, second only to climate change, which is more existential, but our ability to deal with climate change is significantly impacted by our inability at the moment to get a handle on the ever-growing amount of disinformation. And just I wanted to pick up on one point that Esther was talking about, COVID disinformation. If people have not seen it, I would direct you to a report called the Disinformation Dozen on the dozen or so Facebook influencers or Facebook accounts who traffic in the most anti-vax disinformation. Those 12 people between them make about $35 million a year. The top Facebook influencer on anti-vax topics, which I will not name, is worth about $100 million. These people are doing it for the money. Not all of them are doing it for the money. Some very famous people are doing it for the notoriety, but it is a business. If you can convince people to not trust the institutions and the services that are around them, but instead to trust your supplement or your energy bar or your crystal or your whatever it is and buy that instead, then you can make an awful lot of money. And people, that is one of the prime reasons that the anti-vax movement particularly has gained such traction over the last year, helped, aided and abetted by some very high profile people who frankly should have known better. But I'll pause there and see if anyone else has questions or comments.
Great, thank you for that, Claire. Sophia, Ehsan, do you have any? Do you want to react, respond in any way before we go to Q&As, or you don't have to if
Thank
you
you.
don't want to?
No, I really enjoyed all the talks, and I don't have anything to add really to the discussions because I agree with all of them, and there are some points that came up. One was the actual. I would say in terms of an academic researcher, the fascinating discussion around defining disinformation and whether we should keep using the word fake news or whether we should just add classifications to disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, information disorders, and all the different classifications, or which we were actually in a study that Sophia and I did recently published. We looked at how users, ordinary users and not academic researchers, use these terms, including the different definitions of information, disinformation or misinformation. We also included the term fake news there because it has entered our public discourse for better or worse. And even the words propaganda, and saw that when it comes to ordinary users, the whole thing can be actually boiled down to adversarial narratives, because as an ordinary user, it's the purpose of using these terms that matters most, and that's delegitimizing their enemy or their adversary. They don't necessarily distinguish between fake news, disinformation, or misinformation. They know who they should use these labels against. So that was the most fascinating topic for me in the whole discussions, and how no matter how we look at the whole disorder of information, we always end up to adversarial narratives and the different ways or purposes or aims that people rely on this adversarial narrative as really the nodal point of the whole information discourse.
Thank you, Ehsan.
And for me, I think probably just going to conclude because I really covered everything. I think I'm just really fascinated by the variety of views on disinformation only within this panel, and actually how we all complement each other in terms of how we study or how we debunk or how we identify disinformation through also like advertisers and who sponsor them, through actual fact checking and checking particular facts, through amplifying it through social media, and also mainstream media. So I think we actually complement each other a lot in this regard, and covered mostly one of the kind of circles of how misinformation and disinformation is formed, born, and how it circulates and how it's funded, who are behind it, who are the main actors spreading it, who are the main actors sponsoring it. So I think today's discussion really well covered all of those aspects.
Thank you so much. That's great. So let's turn to a couple of questions that we have from our audience, and the first one is a little bit long. I'll read it anyway. So it's from Ariel. Ariel says, when media outlets debunk disinformation, they often fall into the trap of accidentally conferring legitimacy to the disinformation, as was mentioned. There may be a point though where refusing to cover this content can look like a cover-up. I'm curious how we should think of the wider information ecosystem when looking at this issue. Public health authorities, advertising, politicians. I think the question to respond to that would be interesting to hear from one of the panelists. I think that's what we can have time for. Would be the issue about the refusing to cover content may look like a cover-up. How can we think about that? Who wants to go on that one?
I might answer that one, Patrick. Look, I think this is a really this is like the big question. You know, it's the $64,000 question. I've been doing quite a bit of thinking about this myself, because I mean this is exactly the problem, which is that at what point do organizations, be that political organizations, community organizations, what have you, at what point do they intervene? And I think it seems to, certainly from the research that we've done so far, it looks like early intervention is really critical. So being able to not leave a story to fester, basically, and to kind of build up a degree of momentum or kind of critical mass, because by that point, once it's been sort of jumped on by conspiracy theorists, it's quite hard to debunk. But I think that what's also quite important as well, and this is more intuitive, but something that I'm definitely looking into more, is that I think that combating misinformation has to come from a frame that makes sense to the people who are inclined to believe it. So it's not enough to say, well, scientists say that climate change is real, or it's not enough to say, well, scientists say that vaccines are effective, because if the problem is that people, for example, would say that, well, I don't trust scientists in the first place, then that's actually really useless. So it's much, much better to be able to, I think, make arguments that stay within the kind of frame of reference that people can actually understand and have actual meaning to their own lives. I think that's an important part of it, and to go to the example that I was using, it seems actually a lot easier, a lot better to actually say to someone who's inclined to believe that Trump actually won the 2020 election, that, do you think it's actually, more likely that, every single opinion poll was, biased in the lead up to the election, and what do you think is more likely that that this occurred, or that actually just that he lost and that it's just people are unhappy with the result, rather than saying, but all of these people have independently verified, or to actually to shame people into thinking that they're thinking the wrong thing. That probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but yeah, I think that just staying within the kind of frame that people can understand and has meaning within their own lives is critical.
Great, thank you, Stephen. We'll jump between different questions. They're quite different in their focus. So here's one from Michelle, which is very specific, and I'm not sure if you're able to answer this. It's probably for Sophia or Ezan. So the question is, can you, here we go, from Michelle. ABC is below average in terms of indicators in the report, in the content pillar. If that is correct, can you please talk a bit about that? And again, I'm not sure if you can talk specifically about an outlet like that, but that is the question from Michelle.
Thank you. Well, it is a very interesting question. And so, yeah, that is correct. But I can't, well, talk about all the little details particularly about a specific outlet, of course. But that was one of the questions that came to my mind when I first looked at the scores, that how could it be possible that some of the media outlets that I visit every day and fully trust received low scores in terms of content pillar? And the answer is actually because they are very big outlets. When an outlet gets as big as ABC, of course, they sometimes experiment, for instance, by, I'm sure those of you who read the ABC, you've seen the stories published by their digital news storytelling team, the vertical format with lots of images. If you take a few of them and apply the methodology that we applied, you would most likely not see any fact-based leads because they're not even factual, fact-based stories. A lot of them are character-based stories. A lot of them have to bring in older news and to contextualize things. So that's why we actually do both content pillar and operations pillar, because in some cases, not all of the questions or the indicators that we apply to all media outlets. So it won't be completely helpful to look at individual indicators, because let's say if you're reviewing a news website that predominantly publishes opinion pieces, you won't see any fact-based leads because they're all opinion pieces, or a satire website. So that's why we need to balance all these scores and indicators and the two pillars to get that overall score. And in terms of that overall score, ABC did very, very well. But yes, if we look at specific pillars or specific indicators, there could be a variety of reasons that may lead to higher or lower scores.
Great. Thank you so much, Ehsan. So I'm just acknowledging a question from Guy about the use of fake news, and he questions why we're using that term at all, which since it's so problematic. And I think we've already addressed that question in previously. So I'm just acknowledging that the question from Guy. So thank you for that, Guy. Moving on to a question from David. Do you find that disinformation creators employ particular legitimizing themes to engage wider mainstream audiences with more bonkers narratives? So
actually can immediately think of an example, David. So you know the Save the Children hashtag? So Save Children is actually an organization helping children, right? But it has become one that's very known within the QAnon circle, because they believe that there is a satanic cabal of rich and powerful trafficking children around the world, right? So what happens is sometimes we see a keyword or hashtag being hijacked by people who have a certain agenda. So in the case of Save the Children, we noticed that, I guess in the past couple of years, you notice a lot of the QAnon followers using Save the Children to push their conspiracy theories. And this was especially noticeable before the US election last year. So for example, there was a Save the Children rally. I can't remember where in the US, but somewhere really, somewhere local. And then the local headlines were all about, there's going to be a Save the Children rally in so-and-so location. So the problem is they didn't even address that it's actually a conspiracy theory pushing these rallies. So they reported on these as is. So by the time these were all online, they were also syndicated across different national newsrooms as well. So you can see how, you know, a hashtag or keyword being hijacked by people in a coordinated effort to push a certain conspiracy theory across different states in the US. It got, you know, fed into national newsrooms and also, you know, travel around the world. So there's really no geographical boundary for disinformation. And it's a very powerful tactic actually to hijack a popular hashtag on social media when it's already popular, right?
If I could just also jump in there, I think one of the other things that we see too is this. I mean, there's this great example of the way that creationism came to start getting taught as science in American schools, and the way that occurred was campaigners used this phrase, "teach the controversy." So, you know, just by opening up, first of all, as a controversy in the first place, but that you know, again, thinking about the way in which news is so often framed as you know, needing someone on this side and someone on that side, and giving, you know, often those two sides equal weight. The exact same thing happened with you know, the global warming debate, basically, just to be able to say, well, if there's a debate, and even if it's just, you know, one scientist out of 100, that is a way in which people who are actually quite fringe in the scholarly community get legitimized.
Lovely, thank you so much. So I have one question that I'd like to end with, and it's well, we'll see what you make of it. It's Solomane who's asking, are we losing the battle against fake news and conspiracies? So give me some hope now.
Would you like me to attempt that one?
Yes, please.
Make Suleiman feel a little better, I hope. I think there are 4 key steps that we as a global society need to go through to reduce the risk of disinformation and its harms. And at GDI, we always think of these 4 stages. And this is, you'll see when I go through these, why it's such a whole of society problem. The first is that disinformation risk can be identified in real time. And that's what we're doing here. We are identifying disinformation risk. The second is that the ability to spread disinformation is curtailed. And that's what a lot of the conversation today has been about. It's what are the different roles that different actors can play to not amplify or give oxygen to harmful narratives. It's also about ensuring that tech platforms think carefully about the algorithms that they use to promote content, and ensure that content that is harmful or borderline toxic is not amplified. The third aspect is that the incentives to create or distribute disinformation are reduced, and that's the sort of role of GDI is around making sure that the advertising funding doesn't end up on highly controversial narratives, that e-commerce platforms are not inadvertently allowing conspiracy theorists to sell their merchandise and their hats and their t-shirts on their platforms. Payment systems are not inadvertently allowing extremists and hate groups to monetize themselves using those payment systems or cryptocurrencies or donation buttons. So that's an industry-wide move to make sure that everybody is working towards eliminating the financial incentives to create and distribute harmful content. And then finally, and very importantly, that the susceptibility to disinformation is reduced. And that's a long-term media literacy imperative that we all as societies need to get a lot more educated right from the very youngest age on being discerning. So those 4 things of identifying disinformation quickly, curtailing the spread of disinformation, reducing the incentives to create it in the first place, and reducing our susceptibility as human beings to it together will ultimately reduce the risk of disinformation and its harms. But as you can see, it's a real whole of society challenge.
Thank you so much, Claire. I think that's a great way to wrap up this webinar. I'd like to thank the panel for your insights and engaging discussion. I'd like to thank the audience for your questions and for being with us on this evening in Australia and in this time zone, and early in the morning in other parts of the world. And congratulate the team for great work done on this study, and thank Claire and for good collaboration, and Esther for joining us from First Draft, and of course the good QT people, Tim and Stephen as well, for your insights. So with that, thank you once again, and have a good day and have a good evening wherever you are.